Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I have with me today Zorawar Daulet Singh. He is an expert in India's foreign policy. He's written several books. His most latest book had been this one, Powershift, in which he has extensively dealt with the Ladakh standoff, and he has a very different perspective on it. And he's also the Adjunct Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. Welcome to ThePrint, Zorawar.
Thank you so much, Nayanima, and to ThePrint for hosting this conversation.
Thank you. So let's just first start with China because, you know, it's been 1 year of the Ladakh standoff. I don't think that even India had expected that this standoff will go on for so long. There were hopes that the disengagement will go through once we did the first phase in February. But tell me from your perspective, how do you see this going forward? And the fact that next month will be 100 years of the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party. So what do you see? How do you see this standoff?
Yeah, so I see the standoff, in fact, as a long build-up over the last 10 years, 7 years. The India-China relationship has been spiraling from crisis to crisis, particularly since 2017, but you could even go back to 2013 when you started to have more and more frequent standoffs and contact between the two militaries. And each crisis, if we look back, has sort of brought far more risks of confrontation and escalation. And of course, then we had this Ladakh crisis in the spring of last year. So in fact, there are many schools of thought which sort of try to diagnose this crisis. And in a sense, my book, in a sense, is an attempt to offer a holistic analysis of how we got to this position last year. But it's also looks at the boundary dispute and the legacy. So I would say two main reasons, which we can see both from the discourse coming from China and broadly. One, there has been far more attempts by both militaries to go right up to the disputed line in the last 10 years. I think the Indian policy change began in 2007 at the highest level when the Prime Minister's office mandated a new series of infrastructure projects that have been carrying on, as you know, for the last several years. And they picked up steam in the last 5-6 years, which have allowed the Indian military, which always had an asymmetry, to now reach up to the LAC. China, of course, always had a stronger hand logistically, infrastructurally, but they've also strengthened it. So coming into contact has created a conflict situation, but that by itself does not explain the crisis last year. I think there is also a deeper sense of mistrust. There's a sense coming from China and India that that they don't quite fit into each other's worldviews and their visions for where this post unipolar, now multipolar world order is coming into being. I think that there is a definitely, it can be conjectured that the Chinese have sort of sent a message to India. Perhaps they fear a encirclement around them with the confrontation or competition that they are now perceiving with the United States, and India is seen as a part of that. So one attempt is to neutralize this frontier. I think it's also to do with the possibility that the region itself, that is their periphery, this overlapping periphery of South Asia subcontinent, is now beginning to see a lot more tension, and they are just giving a lot more attention to this front. So there's a debate going on of just how significant is this reorientation of China's military posture. But I still believe, and I think I lay it out in the book, that their priority will remain the Western Pacific. It's just sheer structural logic of the power that the United States and its allies bring to bear. And that provides India an opportunity to settle this crisis or resolve it in the coming months and years in a situation that it might not lose much ground. Now, how that happens lies in the details, and of course, a lot of high-level leadership symmetry.
Mm-hmm. So one aspect in your book really stands out, especially, I mean, in the Ladakh chapter is on this Ladakh standoff. You say that, you know, this was not really done for as such territorial gains, right? Because what they want strategically, each parties have it. Like China has Aksai Chin and India has Tawang. This is more of, you know, probably telling each other how powerful I am against you. So can you elaborate on that point a bit?
Yeah, so actually the first point is quite interesting, right? Because whenever somebody is presented with this equation, or that the status quo, that India has more or less what it covers, which is the most strategic and populous territory of Arunachal Pradesh and Tawang, and while Aksai Chin, which has always been strategic, Eastern Ladakh, for the Chinese back in the 1950s because of the access that it provides to Xinjiang, Tibet, they both control those areas. So the core vital security interests are already preserved. Why is this happening? So there are the reason for that is because, and let's actually distinguish between the eastern and the western sector. I think in the eastern sector, which is in Sikkim and Arunachal, more or less the front or the McMahon line or the line of actual control, there is less, let's say, gray zones and ambiguity. While in the Ladakh sector, simply because of geography, climate, it's impossible to have reached those front lines. So there's a lot of gray zone areas which weren't permanently controlled and monitored, which allows every seasonal cycle for both sides to go in and probe there. So you're coming to the motives. I think that there is an argument that the Chinese are strengthening parts of the Western sector, which they feel had been left to linger on for far too long. There's an argument that it's only since the 1960s have they really now strengthened the position and bringing it to bear. So that's one argument. I again look at this as again in a slightly longer time frame, that the dispute again can't be really about territory, right? Because like you said, the territory more or less is controlled by its size, what they seek. So there's something else going on, and that broader picture of geopolitics is what manifests in these crises on the border. So I think that's the way I link it up. It's not just all local, but at the same time, the local bit now, I think when in my introduction, when I suggested that the CBMs that we rely on today were developed in the 1990s when the military balance was very different. The type of border management protocols and the level of patrolling that the Indian and Chinese militaries used to do in 1993, 96 was very different to what they've been doing in the last 10 years. So you need now more sophisticated CBMs to handle the situation, because the alternative of a conflict resolution and a settlement of the dispute does not seem to happen anytime soon. So you're going to have to now build upon those old CBMs, because there's a huge gap between the CBMs and the actual military balance. And so you actually need a lot of technical effort that goes in, and that's where the military planners, with the mandate of the political leadership. And I think if you look at the communique that came out last year, and even the one I'm talking between the two foreign ministries, does allude to future CBMs being discussed, but it needs to be taken a lot more seriously, given the firepower and the forces that are now in close proximity.
Right. So you were talking about the 5-point agenda that was discussed between External Affairs Minister Jaishankar and his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi in Moscow. So I was also coming to that because you talk about a certain kind of resilience in the CBMs, which is why this time, in 2020 June, when the Galwan clash happened, our soldiers could not use firearms, right? And we lost 20 soldiers. Now, when you talk about more robust CBMs, that will come after this engagement and de-escalation happens. But keeping in mind the situation today, when you also talk about growth in infrastructure in the border areas that has really sort of, peaked in the last 4 or 5 years, what do you think the new CBMs can address in terms of the infrastructure development in the border areas at a time when we are not even nearer to anywhere defining the LAC?
Yeah, so I think the CBMs have to look at, I would draw analogies in the Cold War, right? You had maritime CBMs between the United States and Soviet navies in the 70s and 80s. You have similar attempts in the South China Sea and in other areas where now, or in the coming years, you will have the PLA Navy and the US Navy look at possible avoidance of friction mechanisms. You have mechanisms in the Syrian conflict, for example, where the US and Russian militaries have friction avoidance sort of channels where they can sort of avoid coming into contact at the same time. So you need something like that which respond more in real time. So you're going to have possibly you have hotlines. You might have to even create, and there's instances of this where you patrol an alternative, not at the same time, so that face-offs are avoided. There's a whole slew of options that former military commanders and generals have suggested, and they can perhaps be, their consultation can be sought. So I think that's not the real problem of what the CBMs will be. I think there has to be a political will now from both sides, particularly from the Chinese side and the Indian, to start going in that direction. And I think the point that I make is resilience of CBMs. I would say there's still a resilience at a larger level to avoid a major confrontation and an escalation. I think both the Chinese leadership and the Indian leadership, despite everything that happened last year, there was a sense of ultimate strategic restraint. Now, of course, you can attribute that to just the sheer costs of a major confrontation, to nuclear weapons and so many other factors. I don't think China and India truly want to take it up that extra notch. So I think that's where that difference with 62 and the lead up to 62 lies, where the use of force that sort of happened far more casually back then. And I allude to that in the book. I see a little more responsibility with the costs of conflict now from both sides. And that is a calming factor, but you can't just keep relying on that, right? Because in some sense, you could have accidental escalations, like the June 15th one that happened last year, that horrible incident, in a sense, was a lead up to a few weeks, right? There was a lot of local jostling going on and violence at a very low level, and then it just exploded. So those are the kinds of situations that will happen if you just leave tens of thousands of soldiers within a few kilometers, a few hundred yards. So again, political leadership has to bring to bear to instruct their military planners to look at these options.
Mm-hmm. Now, Zorawar, if I can ask you, and I'll gradually move towards the neighborhood. Now, if this standoff is to continue, let's say, and you draw an analogy here with the Sundarungchu Valley, now that went on for about 9-10 years. Now we've seen what the Indian government has stated, right? That unless there is peace and tranquility at the border areas, normal ties with China is not possible. And, we've seen the government taking certain measures, like banning of the apps and then restricting FDI, which happened before the standoff came to light. But do you think this kind of a stance, we can afford to do that with China in the next 10 years if the standoff is to continue? Or you think that maybe that kind of time and age is not there? Even China will be probably willing to not to continue it.
See, I would sort of start by the first question: who gains more from a prolongation or an extended prolonged standoff? I mean, if you look at the situation today, India is bogged down with nearly 100,000 troops and a far more active deployment. It's had to weaken its position on the Pakistan front by redeploying forces. So I think a long standoff does not suit India's interest, regardless of how China handles it. You've got a large asymmetry. For them, maybe redeploying forces is a lot more easier. They have the money, they have the logistics, they can do it. It's costly for them as well, of course. But for India, there is a cost attached to this. But other than that, I think the point here is that what do you really want now out of the relationship with China? And where do you see yourself fitting into this new world order? I think those are the questions that will allow India to formulate a more sophisticated China policy. So, and on this point of how will the standoff be ultimately resolved to the satisfaction of both sides, there is going to have to be some give and take at that broader level. So I think the Indian strategy or the stated policy at the moment that we're only going to focus on the border standoff and nothing else on the relationship with China, I think that will have to give way to a more holistic, grand framework of a conversation with China, where we want the status quo ante in the Ladakh sector. We want certain assurances of peace and tranquility. We want CBMs that actually work. Now, what does China want? Maybe it wants reassurances on certain geopolitical aspects, maybe on let's say, what's happening in the Western Pacific. Where's India involved there? So I think both sides have cards up their sleeves. The question is, they have to bring it now to the table in a much bigger strategic dialogue that the Prime Minister and Xi Jinping will have to eventually enter into. Because just focusing on the standoff and just keep on coming out with another series of core commander meetings or these other mechanisms, MEA-led, is just going to keep it going, right? And who's gaining from this? Certainly India is not gaining from this. So you're going to have to eventually come to a more packaged understanding. Maybe it's not a modus vivendi, but you're going to have to kick the can down the road. You're going to have to stabilize it if you want the border to be settled and peace and tranquility to be restored. Now, that give and take, you also have certain cards, right? You have pressure points on the Chinese. You have a strong relationship that you built up with the Quad, with the United States. Now, the idea is to sort of get assurances between both sides. And that's where the art, statecraft, and high politics and diplomacy comes in.
Mm-hmm. So that, of course, brings me to the next question. You said that, India has to take a call, but question is, can China also afford it to continue it for as long as they want? And with these pressure points, like the Quad, as you mentioned, and there are also voices that believe that India should be part of more such power coalitions, as they sort of face China. But do you think that really acts as a pressure on China? Because we've seen they're also going into other kind of coalitions. They are there in our immediate neighborhood and beyond. We've seen the kind of deal they've had with Iran. So, the world is also changing. So what, in your view, could be a solution when it comes to India having, aligning more with like-minded countries, if I can say so?
So let's put it this way. The idea that India needs a balance of power strategy to manage China's rise, I think that's well accepted, right? And that's been from the very start. From the 1950s, India's policymakers have been looking at developing ties with the superpowers or any major power to produce better security for India. I think where the crisis with China eventually always took over is whenever the second leg of this policy was you broke down the engagement with the Chinese. You couldn't sustain it. So you need both pillars. And my book sort of lays that out quite clearly, the historical lessons. You need a balance of power strategy, but you also need a very sophisticated, smart, intelligent engagement policy with China. And when you have both operating at the same time, you will see the Chinese feel less threatened, more respectful to India, and also keeping the relationship stable. I think where in the last 5-6 years, we kept alternating between these two, and we didn't have both in place. And whenever we lost one, it led to a crisis. So I mean, this is going slightly into perhaps a policy prescription, but you need both pillars. So if you're going to do the Quad, you're going to have strong engagement with China. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to develop ties with Vietnam and Indonesia and Japan and Russia, you also have a decent amount of economic engagement with China, right? So that you are signaling that you are there, that you're not precipitating a counter move by the Chinese. Because as you have yourself alluded to, the cards that they have up the sleeves in the neighborhood with Pakistan, with the smaller neighbors, they also can make life difficult for India. So why would you want to go down that path when you can arrive at something that gives you a sense of stability, prosperity in the region, and at the same time does not undermine your security? So that's the balance you have to strike.
So, Zorawar, if I can really ask you now, focused on the neighborhood, right? We have this neighborhood first policy, although this is not the first time we are focusing on the neighborhood. We have several regional initiatives like the SAARC, BIMSTEC, and now the Indian Ocean region. But you very much have China in your neighborhood, okay? You can see the kind of alliances they are having and the deals in Sri Lanka. Bangladesh also, of course, sees China as one of its, same equal partners as it sees India. Then there is Pakistan, then there is Iran, and Iran has now a new leader. So a new president. So in this dynamics, how do you think how important it is for India to go for all these regional initiatives? Maybe SAARC, maybe BIMSTEC, because these end of the day really help you in developing the economic linkages as you were talking about.
Yeah, that's an important sort of new development that's happened in the last 10 years. I think the type of footprint that China has in the neighborhood has never really been seen for perhaps a millennia. So what it's done is it's altered how India deals with its neighbors, or it should, and it is doing that, because today India's neighbors have a lot more flexibility, room for maneuver, and more choices in how they look at India and China. And I think a lot of the agenda for how India and China interact in the neighborhood, ironically, is being driven by how these smaller states sandwich between the two, whether it's Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, are in a sense wanting ties with both India and China. So how does India respond to that, in a sense that the old policy of simply squeezing out China or pushing it out? I don't think we have the power for that. I'm talking of the economic power, the institutional power, the soft power. So because they're already there. So how do you arrive at a regional policy that allows your smaller neighbors to have stable economic developmental ties with China, and at the same time draw certain red lines where they don't start falling into a Chinese orbit and undertaking anti-India postures and policies? So, and if you look at it quite in a sort of a dispassionate way, I don't think we can make a sort of a blanket assessment so far, or a proclamation that all of India's neighbors have completely fallen into the Chinese orbit, right? That's obviously not true. I think they're retaining their autonomy. They're still proud of their national identities. And that's a good thing. So we can encourage that. We can encourage regimes and political formations that strengthen nationalism or strengthen a sense of independence, because that's the leverage we have. But if you're going to say that I want South Asia to be in the old British Indian sort of Raj mentality of completely under India's rule or influence or sphere of influence, I think that world has passed us by. And it'll be a long, long time before we ever develop that type of power, comprehensive national power, to reclaim that sole leadership position that we had briefly become accustomed to in the 19th century and early 20th century. So it's a multipolar South Asia as well.
Mm-hmm. So, keeping China in mind, how do you see India's, relationship with the US is sort of, is it changing? Is it the same? Do you think that under the Biden administration, although we are seeing, how he sort of made sure that the Quad Summit takes place, and we have a long way to go when it comes to really sort of strategically aligning with the US, but although that has really happened a lot. But again, when it comes to trade and economics with US, things have not really moving in that fast pace. No. So now my question is, do you think within this war between US and China, where is India right now? Because we've heard a lot how US wants to leverage India against China. But frankly, talking about the bilateral ties as such, do you think that is also defined how India behaves with China? Or basically, how do you see this scheme of things, the ties between India and the US?
Of course. So that's the ultimate macro context today, right? That US-China relationship is, whether we like it or not, going to play a very profound impact on India's foreign policy. How we look at that evolving competition, I think first is we've got to accurately try and interpret where that relationship is going. So in the book, I have a long chapter on US-China ties, and one of the main themes that I bring out is, and I'm not alone here, I think this is shared somewhat in the strategic community and even in other countries, that the US-China relationship is not going to emulate the US-Soviet rivalry. It's not going to be this existential conflict of an ideological clash and complete separation, right? You have a lot more interdependence here. They're more entangled. So the nature of competition is different. I see it's going to be a competition for control over important parts of the international order. Yeah. So if that's the type of competition, I think that's a more rational competition. It's a competition where you want to project power and influence rather than you are seeing the other as an existential sort of enemy to your way of life. I don't see that happening yet. Certainly not from the Chinese. And I don't think the United States, with its accumulation of domestic problems in its body politic, can really wage a Cold War. So what we're left with is a somewhat more of a complex trend towards competition, and how India leverages that. I think if you look at this in this triangle, you have really weak relations with the Chinese. If you were able to stabilize them, or at least make them better than the US-China relationship, then you're sitting in a far more comfortable position, because you have pretty solid, robust ties with the United States. If you improve your relations with the Chinese just better than what the United States has with China, I think that gives India a sense of leverage. But other than that, I think there has to be this a sense of restraint where you don't get overawed by some of the rhetoric that surrounds US-China relationships. I also see the Biden administration, even though it started off on a note where it's course correcting somewhat from Trump, where it's not going to rule out interdependence and economic engagement. I think there's a trend line that it's wanting to focus more on the Western Pacific. I think that's kind of clear also when you look at, let's say, the Biden-Putin summit, where trying to stabilize one front to focus on Asia. So all these signs, when I look at it from a very selfish point of view of India's national interest, is if China is going to be focused more on East Asia, more on the Western Pacific, I don't think it necessarily leads to instability on the India-China front. So there will be possibilities of a détente, a thawing of the current crisis. So I think that's clearly a possibility. I think what we need to be cautious about is the United States and China both will want to pull as many states into their visions of world order, and not an alliance, but networks of states. And we would want to obviously resist being completely drawn in, and at the same time benefit from ties. So I think that's where that balancing act lies, that can you retain your independence to an extent where you are able to pursue your own security interests and your developmental interests? Because a lot of the competition between the United States and China is going to come in the technology space, in the supply chains, in the manufacturing sector. And you want to benefit also from what's happening in Asia as well. So it again calls for a more complex, sophisticated approach to the US-China competition.
So we are
that's what I lay out in the book, at least. Yeah,
so we are seeing what is happening at the 5G space and other things. I think that will be defining the future. So let me also ask you on this global triangle that you talk about, right, where you bring in Russia as well. I mean, the relationship between US, India, and Russia, India, and of course the China factor in between. We've heard what President Putin recently said in an interview about China not being an enemy, rather they are very good friends. So within all of these, Russia is also a very important country for India. We are going to have a 2+2 soon, probably once the pandemic sort of takes it subsides. So do you think that India will be able to do that balancing act when it comes to US, Russia, China, and of course there is this Middle East, because if we are constantly engaged with China on the borders, I don't really understand how will we continue doing the balancing act.
So when you look at the relationship with Russia, I think despite the Russia-China partnership, which is really aimed at the global balance of power and trying to reorient America's any remnants of the unipolar role that they have in their mind. I think that's the real purpose of how the Russians look at it. But when it comes to Asia, Eurasia, even the Western Pacific, I don't think Moscow necessarily would like China to be the next dominant power, right? So there is a convergence, a long-term, even a medium-term convergence in a multipolar Eurasia and a multipolar Asia, like we have with Japan, like hopefully we'll have with the United States, if it is to give up slightly on some of the older legacies that it's gotten accustomed to. So I think that part can still work. I think what you're suggesting is that can we avoid getting bogged down in the subcontinent, in the frontier, and look at a bigger sort of role for India, right? I think that's where, and partly that I'm a little skeptical, not just because of the frontier problem, but because our domestic issues of an economic slowdown, imbalanced growth. I think the deepest sinews of power are now starting to become more and more visible, and a real check on the level of aspirations that India can have. So I think it's probably better for India's policymakers to have an honest sort of reflection on where they stand today in the global sort of pecking order. And if they want to raise their profile and status based on real power, then maybe the next decade or two should be used to pursue far more substantial reforms, reorient the economic landscape in India, because you'll have a much stronger hand there. Because I think there's only so much of what clever diplomacy and statecraft can take. And we've tried that, and that has its own value in extreme crisis. even let's not face it. I mean, I'm slightly digressing. Even the crisis with China last year, it was also the relationship with Russia and the United States that both, in a sense, helped India navigate and avoid a more extreme situation, right? The Russians were privately also encouraging the Chinese to sort of calm down.
Right.
The United States was offering intelligence to India. So these are levers that you have. You have bigger friends, but they can only do so much. I think that the internal power renewal that we need to undertake, India needs to undertake, I think that's where you will really, if you were to do it somewhat successfully, India has a better hand in the coming decade. And for that to happen, you do need a stable relationship with China. You can't be engaged in region-wide competition where you are short of resources, you have a massive 5-to-1 asymmetry that I lay out in the book, and you're doing all this, right? So there are going to be trade-offs to be made. They're going to be tough trade-offs. They're not going to be easy to absorb and sell to the broader Indian establishment, but they have to be done, because if you do not do that, you're just kicking that can down the road and you're going to face more problems in 2030, where the power differential is actually even wider. And you have not really made a mark in shaping how the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific is really coming into being.
So when you say that, do you think, and if I can directly ask you, because we've seen in the first term of the Modi government, there was this aversion to trade, right? And more focus on bringing FDI. I know this can be a real sort of economic question, but then that also comes in, overlaps with diplomacy, because if you don't have good trading relationship, you can't, build these parallel supply chains or linkages that we talk about. So two things. Was walking out of RCEP, was that a good decision? Or do you think that India, we can see now, has suddenly, the government now has started putting more focus on the trade agreements, be it the European Union or other countries? So do you think trade is another way where, as you rightly said, that, there's so much that clever diplomacy can do? So do you think we really now need to have a good, probably a trading, negotiating architecture and go into larger trading agreements?
So in fact, this interesting U-turn that's been happening in the last 5 years, right? The Modi government came in 2014, very gung-ho, full of enthusiasm for the old globalization model. And then it's sort of the policy shifted to the Atmanirbhar, focusing on self-reliance. Pulling out of trade. And now you're beginning to see somewhat of a course correction. I think all this really suggests is that globalization is here to stay. It's going to take slightly a different detour in Asia and globally. Now, how do you want to fit into that should also be dictated from your own internal developmental goals and objectives, not just geopolitics, right? Geopolitics might want you to completely be linked with one type of a supply chain, which may be even more costly and expensive. What does India need to do? You need to access the more flourishing East Asian political economy, what Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and of course China are intrinsically sort of interlinked with in very, very complex and deep ways that can't be severed in the coming years. They may take different turns. So we are not even part of that. So I think the first step should be to go ahead there. But at the same time, I'm sympathetic, and of course, that you want to develop your own domestic industries and sectors. So how do you want to go? At what pace? Which sectors? This requires a much more sophisticated blueprint than just saying that I'm going to go towards Atmanirbhar or I'm going to now re-engage with RCEP, right? So where do you want to fit into that supply chain, and where do you then your private sector has to be brought on board, right? We are, for whatever you like it or not, there are many private, large, medium enterprises that are going to fulfill this ambition of economic engagement. Where do they fit in? So I don't think we're really having those deeper conversations and internal coalition building or debates on where should they want to fit into this.
Mm-hmm. So you also talk about the BRICS and the new sort of vision for a multipolar world. So do you really have faith in the fact that, because we get to hear different voices, is BRICS, there is no hope left in it, because there is Russia, there is China in it, where not much movement is happening. Although we saw a lot of movement happening about a decade back, BRICS Bank and other things. And now we are the chair, India is the chair of BRICS, and the BRICS summit is going to happen. What do you think can happen in an innovative way to really push through all this things, a framework like BRICS in the large gambit of things?
So BRICS, really, I look at BRICS as one of many possibilities where large developing economies like India, China, and many others were trying to use as bargaining leverage on the old Bretton Woods model, the US European dominated economic system. So it was an incubator of ideas.
Right.
Some of those ideas have actually manifested into, let's say, the development banks that have come in. A lot of those ideas, ironically, China took on and gave it a national sort of in the Belt and Road, the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, where India is also a major stakeholder. So I don't look at BRICS in itself. I look at the idea that the globalized model does need reform. I mean, you're seeing it from Indian policymakers, right? They call for a more stable multilateralism, a more human-centric development. All these ideas were not there in the old Washington consensus. So these are mechanisms to project those ideas, but eventually they have to yield to institutions and real sort of outcomes. So you don't have enough there in BRICS. So if BRICS does not eventually produce more, like the development bank is one, but it needs a lot more possibilities for the global south to say, okay, this is something which is really adding value to us. The IMF and the World Bank can't do it alone. And also, I think we should also accept that BRICS is not anti-Western or anti even, let's say, World Bank or the old order, so to speak. I think these existing institutions that were developed several decades ago were mainly focused on the US allies in Europe and East Asia. I think the broader swaths of the global economy simply weren't covered. And now if BRICS can add more weight or capacity, and many other networks can come in and coalitions, they actually complement what is a deficit today. The idea that you simply don't have enough development finance, you don't have enough institutions to look at what's happening in the non-Western world, so to speak. So I think that's where I look at BRICS.
Mm-hmm. So lastly, if I can ask you, Zorawar, on this land and maritime silk roads that you talk about in the new silk routes. So if you can, for the benefit of our viewers, what you exactly mean by India, China and the new silk routes, because we are now seeing India going in, especially, in the pandemic and even in a post-pandemic situation, to look at several kind of supply chains, right? So that opens a Pandora's box of supply chains that you can possibly have, although those are mostly on papers, have not really been activated. But do you really see a future coming in where there can be a sort of a new silk route, a new sort of things emerging between these two countries, taking, of course, into account the others?
Mm-hmm. Certainly, in some parts they can, right? I mean, the old Silk Route model, which you saw 1,000 years ago, had a lot of organic networks going through the Indian Ocean, through Central Asia, Eurasia, with far less technology at the time. So now you have the technology, you have the transportation networks, both maritime and land. I think where the problem is that modern nationalisms were not there 1,000 years ago. Today, you have a lot more geopolitics that's playing out and does not want transnational infrastructure. But at the end of the day, a lot of that infrastructure, much of it, if it comes into a supranational body that manages it, will be far more cost effective than having 10 different national projects that are operating and unlinked to each other. So there is a strong case to be made, leaving aside the areas of dispute or let's say flashpoints. If we can sort of leave those aside, there are many areas where you can have different connectivity projects that are happening nationally, but eventually interlinked with each other in some form or the other. So I see the problem not so much in the possibility of interlinking, but the downstream supply chains and industries, they simply are not connected to each other. So that requires people, sectors, lots of other actors to come into the game. So it can't be driven state directed. And that's the lesson from the past. 1,000 years ago, a lot of it was decentralized and organic, where you had traders, scholars, missionaries sort of moving around, and there wasn't a lot of state direction. In fact, both the Chinese empire and the Indian authorities, let's say in the south and whenever, they weren't really totally in control of those geoeconomic networks. Today, they're trying to develop control over those networks, and that in a sense inhibits a lot more organic activity that can emerge. So I think the next phase of globalization in this greater Eurasia should go into a direction where the state sort of still has to drive the broader sort of blueprint, but has to let activity, whether it's human resource networks, students going back and forth, it could happen, infrastructure, energy flows. There's a whole stuff that's going to start happening again, but it does need those physical connections, certainly. So until those physical connections are built, whether those pipelines, the railroads, and you look at here, China, in fact, we keep focusing on the Maritime Silk Road. I think the biggest change in the last 6 years has really been this trans-Eurasian connection from China to Europe, really. Yes. And because these are two large economies that used to be connected to the sea, and now they're going to start connecting more and more through the land. And of course, the volume of trade is still a small fraction of what happens through large container ships. But in the coming decades, as railroad technology, supply chain management, and all that stuff starts becoming more advanced and more high tech, and all that artificial intelligence, robotics, all that comes in, you're going to see almost a complete transformation of Greater Eurasia. And again, that's where India, being on the margins, because it does not have the connections, partly because of partition, partly because we didn't really develop the routes through Iran, let's say, or this ones to Southeast Asia are still underdeveloped. So I think that's, again, something to keep an eye on, because you want to be there when that geoeconomic trends start to take off, which they would in the coming decades.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So one question attached to that then would be, do you think that the Indian industry really needs to play a lot more effective role and not really leave everything to the state to decide? Do you think that has to also come from the industry to be able to take that risk when you open up more in terms of trade and in terms of, building new connectivities?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's some sort of a structural dysfunctional problem, right? I mean, there's been so much of relying on licenses and the old patronage system, or simply small modifications in policy, rather than real strategies of even businesses to develop links in this space. So I think, and also the government does not, I'm not sure of the depth of consultation in even developing our, let's say, connectivity vision, India's Silk Roads, or India. I don't think the private sector has really played a major part in those deliberations. So I think that's where that interlink or those conversations might just lead to something which is not just very, very narrowly security driven, right? So which is how it appears. It needs to go beyond just security driven to broadening the very concept of security, which is human development. And then you have a lot more stuff happening. Right. So it's being led by folks that simply couldn't care less about development and economy, right? Let's put it that way.
Correct. Well, thank you so much, Zorawar. That's been a splendid conversation with you, and thank you for discussing your book, Powershift. But thank you for giving time to The Print. You please take care.
Thanks so much. Thank you for having me.